to Great Ideas, a series about the ideas that have shaped the world we live in, created in association with Victoria University of Wellington. I'm Whelan, and in this series we'll look at what it takes to change our perspective, consider why these ideas still matter, and what happens next. In this episode we'll look at how revolutions shape and were shaped by fashion, literature and the visual arts. We'll also look at moments that changed the arts forever and where the artist's responsibility lies in revolutionary times. I'm joined by a panel of experts from Victoria University, and I've asked them to tell me what their favourite piece of revolutionary art is.
Thank you, Megan. My name is James Meffan and I teach English literature. And my favourite piece of revolutionary art, literature, is J.M. Coetzee's novel Life and Times of Michael Kay.
And why?
Why? Well, the novel Life and Times of Michael Kay is a story about, as most of Coetzee's protagonists are, as an outsider. And Michael Kay is not someone who participates in the revolution that is going on around him. In fact, he's someone who seems to be bent on escaping from all of the camps, as he thinks to himself. Now, it's an interesting novel because Coetzee was taken to task by having a character who does not make history, does not involve himself in history, but seems to seek to hide himself away from this. And without giving too much away, Coetzee's fellow novelist, Nadine Gordimer, attacked Coetzee for failing to pay attention to show due respect to the revolutionary activity that was going on all around them in apartheid South Africa. The interest for me is precisely in the tension between these two assumptions about what revolutionary art can and should be. I think the historical view suggests that in many respects Coetzee was perhaps the more revolutionary thinker for going into a line of thought that asked what is, in a way, unrevolutionary about the revolution. To what extent is the seeking of power by the disenfranchised just setting up another system of power and another group of oppressed?
Hello, I'm David Maskill from Art History at Victoria University, and my favourite work of revolutionary art is a remarkable portrait of the left-wing revolutionary Jean-Paul Marat by Jacques-Louis David, painted in 1793. It depicts the recently assassinated deputy slumping in his bath, writing or putting the last words to a letter. And it's a remarkable image because it's the first time, really, in the history of art that an ordinary person has been depicted as a Christian martyr. David is using the imagery of Christian martyrdom for a political figure. And it's a moment that changed the history of art. In fact, some people refer to this as the first modern work of art.
I'm Margaret Medlyn. I'm the head of classical voice at the New Zealand School of Music, Victoria University. My favourite work of art is Richard Wagner's opera Tristan and Isolde. And why? Because it's so hypnotic, enchanting, timeless, makes time stand still. In it, Richard Wagner breaks down the framework of classical music. He destroys harmonic structures and things that we as humans were expecting to hear and makes us very unsettled. At the same time, he portrays deep and intense human emotions on a grand scale and a timeless scale in a way that draws you in so that you don't really know that it is actually 5 hours long.
Which is a skill.
It's a total skill. It's like reading Lord of the Rings, isn't it? Which completely draws you in, and one gets put off by the thickness of the book, but actually once you're hooked on it, it makes a big difference. In the same way, Richard Wagner's works, he's not interested in the day-to-day scale of things. He's interested in really deep emotions that make us human, that many of us bury, and he brings them to the surface, and in some respects, it's not just the text, but the music makes us examine what it is to be human.
Is that where art is at its most revolutionary? Leaving aside something like an artist who is sort of deeply involved in a revolution itself, is that where art is at its most revolutionary, when it's showing us who we are and what it means to be human, do you think?
Well, I think some people do need to be shown what it is to be. We all need to be shown what it is to be human. Equally, for a standalone piece of art to break down accepted barriers and conformations of style is an artist's duty. That's why an artist, is to confront society and societal expectations and provoke people. And there are very famous examples of art, like Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, for instance, where there was a riot at the first performance, which was certainly not accepted. And Richard Wagner had a lot of fights on his hand, and people who just wouldn't sit through that sort of music or even confront their own feelings to the music. So I think that is a responsibility.
Do you agree with that, David? Is that what makes it an art? Like, you can't just be painting pretty landscapes. You have to be doing something to be considered an artist.
Well, I think Margaret's point about making art that is confrontational is crucial to it being revolutionary. And in the case of David, I mean, I can't think of any other period in history when an artist of that genius was intimately involved in the events that he's depicting.
Because he was a revolutionary.
He was a revolutionary.
Yeah.
He signed the death warrant of the king.
Wow. So that painting that you're talking about, it depicts Marat in the bath where he often worked, and there are, as you say, the symbolism of the martyrdom. What was he trying to convey? What idea was he trying to convey?
I think what David was trying to depict was the fundamental shift from a God-centered universe to a human one. That this political deputy could actually now be treated as a Christian martyr. And of course, at this precise moment, Christianity was outlawed. They changed the calendar so that the birth of Christ was no longer the beginning of the calendar. It was an attempt to wipe the slate of history clean.
And do you think he would have known, he would have had an understanding that painting it in that way would also, as well as what was going on in the world, as well as the revolutionary aspect of what was happening in the world, that it would actually revolutionise painting, that it would revolutionise art? He knew exactly what he was doing?
He knew exactly what he was doing. And, his influence remained for the next generation of French art, even though the monarchy was restored.
James, do literary artists think the same way? When you're writing a novel, when you're sitting down and writing a novel, are you aiming to change the world?
Well, I suspect that the idea of aiming to change the world, actually what we've heard here is that there's the formal aspect of any work of art and its content. And your initial question really was directed towards the content, must the artist engage with what is going on and show these moments? But the answers coming back are all to do with what was revolutionary about the attack on form. And I think that artists often find themselves if not find themselves compromised, find themselves being asked to compromise with respect to one or the other. So the debate that I flagged up between Gordimer and Coetzee was one, in a way, about form. Gordimer, a classical realist Marxist, felt that the important role was to speak truth to power. And because she felt she represented the revolution in South Africa, then it was important that the art was accessible. Coetzee was going to have none of this accessibility. He saw the artist's responsibility to the art per se. So there's a tension there, isn't there? There's not an easy answer, but I think that if I'm picking this up correctly, what we've all identified is, in fact, the importance of the formal revolution attached to the cultural revolution, if you like, the social revolution.
Yeah. And part of that is actually just that you mentioned the word accessible. Part of that is about the language that people use, not even just the, I guess, what the story is about. In that particular case, it really was about the actual language that was used.
Yes, absolutely. So in that particular argument, there was a concern about someone described and possibly the most backhanded attack on Coetzee's novel that what he was offering was a coterie of modernist thinkers in South Africa, which was implicitly all white, some kind of masturbatory release. While Rome was burning, there were these artists off gazing at their navels, and so that kind of tension endures in many, many situations. And I think the works of art that endure seem to be pretty reliably the ones that have been provocative in their manner of representation as much as for what they represent.
I saw someone on Twitter saying the great thing that's going to come out of Donald Trump as president is the protest art and songs and writing that's going to happen. Do you think artists need difficult times to be able to create art? Margaret, I'm going to throw that one to you.
I think that an adversarial component to life stimulates artists. If artists are too comfortable, then everything becomes too easy and too comfortable. Most works of genius are born of difficulty and hardships and confrontations and provocations. And there has to be a reason to change things. There has to be someone fighting against it. And it seems to me that those situations, just as you describe as the possible difficulties of Trump's presidency, will provoke an interesting and maybe stimulating reaction.
So is that what provoked Wagner? Something like that?
I think it was always difficult, his life. And I think his concept in his mind of the way that music was going, he was a person who just went his own way. His personal hardships, he was, at the end of his life, funded by King Ludwig of Bavaria, the Mad King who built Neuschwanstein, who funded him and built his own theatre to his own specifications. So that was like the best piece, I suppose, to have your own theatre in which your own works were presented in the best acoustic. What more could an artist?
What more could any of us want? That sounds great.
Yeah, but Tristan and Isolde was written at a time in the middle of the Ring Cycle, which is a tetralogy, 4 operas together, and the sheer mental feat of writing this lengthy opera in a way of melodic and harmonic disintegration at the same time as writing the Ring Cycle, 4 operas which were quite straightforward harmonically, is quite mind-boggling. So whether he needed that intense work and that intense pressure on it, maybe he did that himself, and we all know artists who put that pressure on themselves to create those difficulties.
And you've said that one of the things that he changed is having a form of artistic control over the audience. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Prior to Richard Wagner, opera was a social event. So people went into these theatres in which the auditorium lights were up. So it was more about being seen and who you were with and what your dress was like and surveying the other members of the audience. And
so the first 10 minutes of the opera now just carried on.
Yes.
Was there the whole time.
Or having flirtations and, boxes at the opera had curtains for a very good reason, because what went on behind the curtains was no one else's business, or maybe was. So he stopped that because the auditorium at Bayreuth is very plain. There are no boxes. All the attention is focused on the stage and the lights were dimmed, so people could not see others in the audience. They couldn't convey messages. And the focus not only was on the stage, but also not on the conductor, because he created a cover over the orchestral pit. And as we know, conductors are very fond of the limelight, so the conductor was not able to have this limelight, and the attention was completely focused on the stage, on his works.
And on the musicalness of it, or the drama, or the story, what was he trying to get people to
Wagner wrote both. He wrote his text for his music, so he had total control of what he did. So I think it was both.
The other thing that he did, I guess, is change how performers performed. It was a very different thing for a performer to perform Wagner than almost anyone else.
Yes, and it has a huge impact upon the singer's body, mainly because of the length. A very famous singer called Birgit Nilsson said the main useful thing for being asset for being a Wagner singer was a comfortable pair of shoes, because she was on her feet for 3 or 4 hours at a time. And that's not to mention the sheer training of getting your body and the muscles ready, then the physical embodiment ready to sing for 3 or 4 hours. The opera I was speaking about, Tristan and Isolde, I've sung Isolde. The first act is 75 minutes singing straight through.
Good Lord.
The second act is, I counted it, and the second act is 63 minutes, and then you have a couple of hours off and then you sing 20 minutes. So, the feat of keeping the text in your mind, it took me 2 months to memorise it, and then every second day I had to write it out. It took me 2 or 3 hours to write a text out. That's how I kept it in my mind.
Good Lord. I don't know, I come back to this idea, David, of the difference between art as this pushing of boundaries and ideas, and pushing everyone involved. So not just the audience, but the artists themselves, in that particular case the performers, as opposed to just painting a pretty landscape, painting by numbers. How do you examine that as an artist? How do you make yourself push that boundary, or how do artists do that for themselves?
Well, taking the case of David, I think there's an interesting parallel with Wagner in that, David blew everyone else out of the park.
Figuratively.
There are a whole lot of artists who we now have tried to recuperate, who were, very well known in their time, but David's force of personality and his single-minded view of what art should be meant that there was no room for dissenting views. So he established a studio in which he trained his students in a kind of Freudian relationship with him. There were no women. Women were completely excluded from the artistic project. And anyone who crossed him, he got rid of.
Which was different to Wagner, just to go back to women. That was, he made roles for women that no one else really had.
In an interestingly contradictory way, because he was very much a chauvinist, and he died in Venice halfway through an article sort of resurrecting the feminist power. But at the same time, he wrote these operas with very, very powerful roles for women who essentially saved the world, or especially in the Ring cycle, they saved the world. And in the case of Parsifal, the last operas, Kundry facilitates everything, and Isolde is the facilitator. It's all to do with, in a very interesting way. But everything that David says, I agree, is the single-mindedness, the obsessiveness, the absolute intention to do it their own way, their only right way, because that idea is in the mind. And the same as David, Wagner would walk over everyone to get what he wanted.
You also have to be pretty single-minded to write a novel.
Yes, well, especially when you're under attack. And I think the interesting thing with Coetzee is that famously he's not one for interviews, generally speaking. He's very reclusive, all of those sort of cliches really about the artist. And, truly he let his own work do the talking. But he does, in one of his rare interviews, he does talk about one of the battles that every artist fights, even in good times, even when there isn't a revolution raging around them. And this is what Martin Amis uses the term the war against cliche. And Coetzee talks about the automatism of language. And I find this really interesting. It's something that I also find that a lot of my students get. If you ask someone, have they tried writing? Yes, everyone's tried writing their own story in particular. And what makes them most dissatisfied is they see that the words come out and they roll onto the page and they sound about right. And at first everyone's feeling, the writer is feeling pretty pleased with themselves. This looks like real writing. Then they think, none of this sounds new. I haven't done anything that hasn't already been heard before. And the real challenge is to find a mode of voice that is singular and distinctive and does not seek the approval of the audience necessarily, does not seek the approval of those participating, even doesn't worry about the feat or the 75-minute duration of the singer. They have in mind what it is they want to do. So yes, that singularity, that singleness of purpose is certainly there with writers and writers who succeed. But again, we come back and since we, in a way, are all talking around something that is tied in with modernism, we come back to a moment where art was at its most obstreperous, really, was at its most ready to tread on toes, to upset expectations and not make it easy.
Mm. Surely in revolutionary times especially, there is an argument to be made that sometimes it should just be easy. Sometimes it should be satisfying to watch a movie or read a book, or that rather for the audience to take you out of that.
No artist, of course, is responsible for the entire artistic project, and there are all kinds. And while David might have blown all comers out of the water, the reality is at any moment many people are writing or working in different modes. So there does seem to be something that smacks a wee bit of jealousy in the attacking of a particular artist for elitism. Can the elite not have their release, not have their pleasures as well? Well, it needn't be a case of elitism either. It's a particular kind of focus, a particular kind of attention that some people are prepared to make and others aren't. And for those who aren't, of course, there are other works of art that are more accessible. I think the problem is when we get too prescriptive and try and tell our artists this is what art looks like in times like these.
Zadie Smith, the novelist who wrote a book called White Teeth, gave a speech last month in which she talks about the idea that White Teeth was about multicultural London, and she now gets asked in interviews 20 years later, were you wrong about multiculturalism? Is multiculturalism over? And she talks about the fact that neither me nor my readers are in the relatively sunlit uplands depicted in White Teeth, but the lesson I take from this is not that the lives in the novel were illusory. Thank you. But rather that progress is never permanent and will always be threatened, must be redoubled, restated and reimagined if it's to survive. I don't claim that it's easy and I don't have all the answers. Well, let's start with that. Should artists have all the answers? Is there when Wagner was writing, is there an idea that he's trying to get across? Is there a point that he's trying to make? Did he think he had the answers?
I think that he was just trying to convey his ideas. But if I can pick up on one of James' points, is that artists or teachers of artists hopefully would provoke, or the people from whom artists learn would get some sort of lessons like what I call the so what factor. So you've made a pretty picture, so what? What are you trying to convey? You've written an entertaining novel, so what? You've written a nice piece of music, so what? What's it going to do? What are you doing this for? So you learn along the way that you have to, if you want to be a true artist, a true creator, that it has to be a reason for doing it, not just making wallpaper.
Or making,
Or so by definition, then, if it's got if it reaches those criteria, then it can and will be revolutionary because it's different.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, but I would contest the idea of a point. A point seems to be, speak to this idea of a single message. Now, if there was a single message coming out of a work of art, I'd want to appeal to the artist to take all the obfuscation away and just give us your message.
Just write it down in one sentence.
What benefit is there in turning that one aphoristic sentence out into spinning it out into a 5-hour opera? Against this, I absolutely agree that the question that hangs over art is exactly so what, but I see it as a provocation. And the point can be the opening up of questions. The point can be actually initiating thinking that the artist doesn't sit at the back of with the answer already. You know, you've been in a classroom situation where you have a sense that the teacher is drilling you because they have an answer they want you to give. That's one kind of question. I have the right answer, and when you reach that, I'll say thank you and we'll have done a good job. The other kind of question is much less comforting because you come up with your answer and you look to the teacher for reassurance that you've said the right thing. And they can't tell you necessarily. It's up to you. You're undertaking this reading process.
Yeah. I guess that's the difference between art and politics. It's answering the questions, not telling us the answers. But then if you look at someone like David, that was heavily involved in politics. Was he making a point or was he asking a question? Or can you do both?
I think he was doing both. And, you know, I mean, the Mara is when it worked. He did many other works during this period which were failures, artistic and political failures. Most famously, the tennis court oath painting, which was never finished. You know, for political reasons, because it was hard to paint a portrait of someone when they'd had their head cut off.
It's a less nice painting.
Yeah, but in the case of the Mara, it all came together for this brief moment. Which is why some art historians, refer to this as the first modern work of art, because it was so contingent on the moment. It wasn't seeking some kind of universal, timeless truth.
Which lots of art has been trying to do.
Which lots of art had done, and David had done it himself earlier in his career when he'd painted, classical stories.
So aren't there two sorts of revolutionary ideas here? So what we've read some of each other's work here, and what I noticed the difference between my choice of Richard Wagner and James's and David's is that your work or the artists you've chosen have definite societal influences, and you talked, James, about how influential fiction was and on society and can revolutionise, and is that a duty or is that a result? And I'm not questioning there the author's duty or the desire to do that. And also paintings, which David and I talked briefly about Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which was the descent of figurative painting into abstractism. And they're defining moments, which is, they don't mean them to be societal changes, but they were. Would you agree with that? Or yeah. Whereas I think Richard Wagner didn't give a damn. It's nothing to do with society, which he didn't. He just went his own way and did whatever he wanted. But he had an emotion and something to convey an overarching theme, and he, I suppose, financially he was pleased he was received with some respect in the end, which sort of really life is all about money, I suppose, in some respect. But, coincidentally on the way is revolutionary.
I want to come back to a point that you made, David, about you may not recognise it as this, but one of the things that has come up in a number of these discussions is the idea of luck around revolution, that you need the right time and the right place and the right person or the right people for it to work. Is there an element of luck in that painting? Or was it entirely deliberate?
Well, I guess he was lucky that Mara was assassinated. It gave him the perfect subject. Yeah. And
Marat, not so much.
Sorry?
Marat, not so much.
Not so much, no. But, actually, Marat was, if he hadn't been assassinated, he probably would have had to have been got rid of because he was a dangerous guy.
Yes. And for the revolution, probably.
For the revolution. Yeah. And so, to some extent, David's painting has redeemed Marat in history's eyes as this great martyr, whereas, in fact, he was a bloodthirsty, he wanted everyone dead.
Yeah.
In fact, he signs he votes for the king's death when, but instead of just voting for death, he says death in 24 hours.
Golly. James, you quote Auden?
I was quoting Auden when a Yes.
Yes, saying that poetry makes nothing happen, and that this increasingly is a thing that people think about.
Shamelessly taken out of context, I should say, and people should read the whole poem. But yes, look, I think there's a sense that the arts and humanities, or the humanities, depends how you figure it, is having to argue for its relevance. And that for me, a teacher of fiction, the locus of that question is often why is there a university course teaching made-up stuff? Mm-hmm. Fair question. I put it to my students, and they largely come back with quite unconvincing arguments, I have to say. And I suppose I don't want to make that case here. I don't want to find myself arguing for it, except to say that the persistence of inventive art, the idea that we haven't found the kinds of stories that people like, and therefore all we need to do is keep reproducing them with a few changes, the sort of expectation we might have of Hollywood movies, but rather we want to see what are the possibilities of the form. How might it change the way we think? How might it change the way we approach things? Now, we've been talking about the revolution as primarily a social and political, historical event. But revolution is also intellectual, and that comes up in our discussion about the formal aspects of these works. It's quite interesting in the case of Coetzee, his most well-known and well-received novel, Disgrace, put him very much offside with the black government in post-apartheid South Africa. It represents, to use the crudest of shorthands, it represents black on white rape. And because there was quite a high statistical prevalence of this kind of violence, the black government said to Coetzee, look, you're not helping. We've had the revolution. We're now in the post-revolutionary state. We're seeking the Rainbow Nation. We're seeking that, the afterglow. And it doesn't help when you draw attention, racist attention, the implication was, or was in fact made very explicit, draw attention on the more negative aspects of society. You have to give us time. But Coetzee's question was more fundamental, I think. The focus for writers like Gordimer was the political. I want to suggest that Coetzee's interest is the ethical. Now, the basis for any given revolutionary zeal is usually couched in ethical terms. It's
the right thing to do.
It's the right thing to do. We ought to overthrow, abuse of power where we see it. Coetzee's question says, but what is at the heart of that revolutionary zeal anyway? Is your violence really so different from the violence of the oppressor? Mm. A very hard question to answer, and certainly Disgrace doesn't answer it. In fact, it's one of the most uncomfortable novels because where it goes and the kind of responses that some of the characters make seems either to verge on martyrdom. The character David's daughter Lucy, who is raped, makes an accommodation with some local people which sounds desperately unsafe for her, desperately unsatisfactory. She agrees to marry someone who may even have had some involvement in the attack on her. The crudest way of reading this is to say she represents an example that none of us can use, so this work is not relevant. Mm. But to think through those kinds of questions, to ask what our own personal responsibility, to move beyond this idea that the artist is the one we're focusing on, let the novel reflect back on our own selves and our own commitments and our own beliefs, is, I think, one area where literature can be relevant and revolutionary. You
said the government sort of said, you're not helping, and was his answer, it's not my job to help? That's not what I'm here for?
Well, as I say, he's very loath to directly engage, particularly with non-academic criticism. His answers are usually in the forms of his novels. Every now and again we see fragments of those kinds of arguments crop up in his novels, in the novel The Master of Petersburg. We have a revolutionary who says, enough with cleverness, enough with your endless talk, your this and that, and it becomes a kind of a parody, a pastiche of that sort of sensibility that says there's some time where it's best not to think, and by being on the side of thinking, Coetzee is not on the side of bear baiting, if you like.
Yeah.
He's not going to engage in something where the terms cannot be a full discussion, where they are shut down to that extent, where they're rendered in black and white terms, which is precisely what he is attacking, and ultimately, surely, what the end of apartheid sought.
David?
Can I
Yep.
can I just pick up on that, because I think what you're saying about Coetzee is very interesting, because he's someone who he's much more nuanced. He's much more prepared to have alternative views. I mean, when you think about, moments in revolution, most of the time you're asked to make a decision, to be on one
and a
side.
very black and white decision between
one side or
the
the other. And, let's face it, there's nothing black and white about David's art. I mean, it's you have to believe it, or otherwise, there's no point. And most revolutions have produced very bad art on the whole. I mean, the Russian Revolution, did terrible things to Russian art. I mean, what happened to Kandinsky, and suddenly we had this awful Soviet realism. Whereas in the case of David, I think there was just this moment, and it was a very brief moment when it all came together. But it's not art that lets you have multiple views at all.
To go back to that point about you're not helping, was he trying to help the revolution?
Oh yes, absolutely.
And that was it, and that would have been clear in his head that was a goal.
He was a fully paid up member of the Jacobins.
Is that does that go against? I mean, if the idea of being, an artist is to challenge and to make us uncomfortable and all of that sort of thing, if he was making the people with whom he was working comfortable while making the audience uncomfortable, and I'm leading to another question here, but while making the audience uncomfortable, is he still being challenging in the right way?
That's where you get into the, I suppose, is it art or is it propaganda? It is propaganda. I don't think there's any question, but it's also art.
It can be
in
both.
this case.
We've talked a reasonable amount about the responsibility of the artist. What about the responsibility of the audience to look at it? I guess especially with Wagner, 5 hours sitting listening to opera, that's not easy for a lot of people. What's the responsibility of the audience there?
Well, feats of concentration. I also think it's a responsibility of the composer to beguile and seduce the listener into continuing to listen, and also the responsibility of the artists who are portraying the work of the composer and librettist to sell it in all respects. Otherwise, there's very famous examples of works being resurrected for certain performers because no one else was interested in singing them or didn't have the technical facility. But I think in Wagner's case, he was very careful to choose people for these important works, and that was another form of his control, that he insisted on his works being replicated as he wrote them, because before that time, someone could just take a score and chop it down, do whatever they wanted, and he had no right. He didn't get any royalties, didn't get any rights, so he undoubtedly changed those rules.
So he's to blame for copyright law.
Totally. But that meant that he had an income, but also that he had could at some stage have some sort of control, certainly in the premieres, over who sang and first portrayed, and so hence sold his work to the audience. And I think that's probably the biggest difference between the performing arts and the non-performing arts, is that an artist or a writer has an opportunity to rework and rework and rework. But of course, as does the composer, but in the end, that is nothing but text on the page unless the performer gets up and performs it. As though there's a third party in the revolutionary.
There's a conduit between the artist and the
That's
audience.
right.
Yeah.
So you have rubbish performers, then you're not going to sell anything.
You're not going to. You're not going to.
And so then the audience is less than impressed, etc., etc. So does rely on the third party.
Is the audience? Does the audience have to think about it? Is that the responsibility of the audience to understand why his work was revolutionary, to understand why this is different than anything that went before it? Or is it acceptable to just sit and listen for 5 hours?
Well, Wagner is one of these composers whose music can take whatever director throws at it generally, and there are relatively few composers like that, because the story is definitely, in other composers, definitely in one place. But in Wagner, and the canon have different times, and Whelan Wagner, that's Richard Wagner's grandson, very famously changed the how things were directed in the theatre after the war, and Bayreuth there wasn't much money, so he produced these operas which had very naturalistic settings on a bare stage with a disc, and everything was done with lighting, and that was very revolutionary at the time. So that was Wagner's grandson. But it can take anything that a director wants to throw at it generally, and does do all the time. And so, yes, in some respect it is, and I have been in this experience, you go to a Wagner opera and you go, okay, so the director has seen some sort of connection between shoes being thrown over the scenery onto the stage and what the singer is singing about the story. So in fact, I find that distracting, because you're sitting there most of the time going, so what's the connection between, for
Those
example,
two things, not listening.
Those two things, and you don't listen to the work of art. So theoretically, it should still be storytelling, but with a different slant.
David, what about if I'm looking at the painting? Is my responsibility to do, that's quite pretty, and look at the colours he used, and isn't that lovely? Or is my responsibility to actually sort of think, what did he mean? What was this about? Why is he telling me this?
I think it is, yes. Because to some, you have to respect the artist's intention, and ask the question, what is who is this person depicted? What's going on? Why was this painted? Those are the sorts of questions that we ask, and my students ask all the time. Because in most cases their sense of history is somewhat limited.
So we should all know slightly more history than we do, especially art history. But by the same token, is my responsibility as the audience to get out of it what the artist intended to me to get out of it, or am I free to think, well, actually, I have a different interpretation?
I think every person will react differently, and that's perfectly valid. But I do think there's a responsibility to try and understand the original intention, as far as that is possible. In some cases we simply don't know what the intention was. But in the case of David, it's all very well documented. But it's interesting that you bring that up, because when in 1989, which was the celebration of 200 years, they had a huge David exhibition at the Louvre, and there was no mention of David's revolutionary involvement.
Right.
And the Mara was not there; was not in the exhibition.
Because they didn't want to remember it?
They didn't want to remember it.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that means that the context of a lot of his work is gone, right?
Yes. Yes. And it was, I think they found it a bit embarrassing that their great artist was a revolutionary.
James, what about for a novel? Because novels have any number of interpretations.
It's very interesting for me. But one of my sort of key areas is literary theory, which, as everyone knows, became deeply objectionable and around the 70s and 80s and onwards, and it wanted to turn everything on its head, as it routinely does. One of the great divides that still exist in the disciplinary study of literature is this question of intentionality, whether we should remain committed to the idea that what we're seeking when we read is to come as close as we can to the artist's intention, or on the other hand, and this is a view associated with postmodernism and post-structuralism, whether the text is something more like a catalyst, something that triggers, enables a process that happens in each individual reader's brains. Now, one thing I find with my students, they often are very resistant to a non-intentionalist approach, and their great fear is that if we do away with author's intention as the validating principle for our reading, then nothing means anything, and we can say any mad stuff we want, and everything's as good as everything else. And this is how postmodernism is typically caricatured in the press. But of course, the nature of language, the same thing that Coetzee called language is automatism. Language is by its nature something that produces convergence. The reason we use language, the reason we are here searching for that correct word, is that we are seeking to converge, to draw some agreement. So language is not by its nature something that simply frees us up. And yet, as the French philosopher Jacques Derrida very patiently unpacked, language will not be constrained either. It is a system of differences that leads outwards. So the very thing that it seeks, convergence, understanding, agreement, is something that language introduces as a problem. If I don't understand a word, just to use an example, I look up in the dictionary. What am I given? I'm given a whole brace of other words to use to try and locate that word. If there are some words in the definition I don't understand, out and out I go ad infinitum. Now, those of us who have a certain kind of education work very hard on convergence. We work very hard on getting a shared set of terms, a shared set of historical points of reference that we can draw on. So we are interested, absolutely, in some kind of agreement in our interpretive efforts. But the text won't allow that. And I suspect that the reason some works remain durable is not actually because they're universal and timeless in the sense that there's something in them that remains unchanged. I think the reason that Shakespeare, for instance, is so appealing is as much to do with the fact that a work can be resituated in World War I context and done as a feminist critique of patriarchal assumptions about ownership and so on. It's actually its openness to reinterpretation and reuse and redirection that sustains it, that keeps us interested.
But that also still requires a challenging thought. So so a feminist critique of the patriarchy is still a challenging thought. It still requires that work to still make us uncomfortable, albeit in a different way.
I think Margaret pinned it down beautifully by suggesting that on the one hand there is this responsibility to an attentiveness which is motivated, I think, by a desire to converge with the producer of the work. I have no doubt about that. But at the same time, the capacity to do something more, to do your own work, sometimes distracting to be sure, but sometimes absolutely illuminating. Those two things can coexist, and of course any artist worth their salt knows this, and they won't abandon their audience wholly. Somewhere between Ulysses, brilliant, worth the effort, and Finnegan's Wake, one strictly for the completists. Joyce lost his love for the audience to too great a degree, I suspect. Lost his concern to accommodate his reader, made it too hard. Your question of accessibility comes up again. But we're dealing with a continuum, and to say that some degree of accessibility is a necessary first step is not the same as saying everyone should be able to read this particular work.
And should everybody be able to view a work?
Oh, of course.
We'd love them.
course.
We'd love them to, in two senses. I think we'd love them to have that experience. We'd also love them to be interested enough to go and seek that historical knowledge that lends depth to it, and that's why people come to university. Of course, they are seeking that that extension of their understanding that will make the experience richer and more satisfying.
That is a perfect place to end. My thanks to Dr David Maskill, Dr Margaret Medlyn and Dr James Meffan from from Victoria University. Great Ideas was made in association with Victoria University. It was engineered by Phil Benge with production from Adam McCauley, and our executive producer is Tim Watkin. You can find other episodes of this series and more of RNZ's podcast at rnz.co.nz.